Okay. Okay. Hello, welcome to the Heal Your Art podcast. This is Jenny.
This is Itzela.
Today, we're honored to have a guest. He's Dr. Guak, who specializes in neurology and more recently in writing. He published a book called The God Neuroscience Found. It combines his profession in neuroscience as well as his personal pursuit and interests in theology and religion. Now, we're going to pass it on to Dr. Guak to talk about some of his own experiences.
Thank you both, Jenny and Isela. Hello, I'm Dr. Guak. I'm a neurologist in Bundang, South Korea, and I've been in practice for close to 30 years, mostly seeing patients with headache and epilepsy, dementia, and other neurologic conditions. And more recently, I've also become a writer. The book we will talk about today, The God Neuroscience Found, is my attempt to bring together two realms of my life that I lived in separately for a long time, the neurology clinic and the church. It's a real joy to be with you today. Thank you for having me.
Thank
Yeah, of
you.
course. You mentioned that you would like to close the gap between the two realms. So after all these years of being a scientist, what motivated you to write this book?
Two things pushed me to write it. First, after 30 years of reading brain scans and sitting with patients, I noticed that neuroscience, wherever it went deepest, opened more questions than it closed. The classic example is what David Chambers calls the heart problem. Why does neural activity become the feeling of the color red or the feeling of grief? Neuroscience has not answered that. And second, more personally, I have lived for a long time with two separate rooms in my head. In one, I was a neurologist looking at data. In the other, I was a Catholic praying at Mass. And I slowly realized the wall between them was thinner than my training had told me. The book is what happened when I finally let those two rooms speak to each other.
Oh, amazing. I
Yeah.
have another question. Why did you decide to become a neuroscientist?
Honestly, I first went into medicine just because I loved biology. But in medical school, when we started learning about the nervous system, I had a small moment I still remember. I thought, isn't just a body. This is a person sitting inside the skull. There are almost as many neurons in one brain as there are stars in a galaxy. So each of my patients was carrying a whole galaxy around with them. And in neurology, the patient's story and the galaxy meet every day in the clinic. That meeting is what pulled me in, and is still what keeps me interested after 30 years.
Mm, that's so interesting and honestly very inspiring. So, adding on to Jenny's question, you talked about having two roles in your head. Um, so how did you decide to be Catholic? Was it your family's choice or your personal choice?
Both, actually. I was born into a Catholic family in Korea. As a child, church was the religious experience for me. It was just a natural background of daily life. The incense of Sunday mornings, the stained glass, the rosary I said shoulder to shoulder with classmates. It was simply the way we lived. Then adolescence came, and for the first time I doubted. I wondered, is it really there? Am I just believing what the others around me believe? What kept me from drifting away in those years was not a big argument. It was one or two people, those whose lives were quietly, unshoweably steady in a way I couldn't explain. And then in my 20s, I chose it again as an adult for myself. So the short answer is my family gave me the faith, And in my 20s, I received it a second time, this time as my own.
Oh, I see. Okay. Now that we know enough about his personal experiences, let's dive deeper into more STEM-based and sciencey part of the book. Please listen up if you want to become a neuroscientist or pursue medicine. Okay, I'll start with a warm-up question. How would you define neuroscience?
Neuroscience.
Yeah.
Uh, the textbook definition is neuroscience is a scientific study of the nervous system, especially in the brain. But I like to define it in the more human way. Neuroscience is the discipline that asks what exactly is happening right now inside the person listening to me. Why do we remember? Why do we feel pain? Why we fall in love? All of that is happening in the brain. And neuroscience looks into the brain with imaging, with the physiology, with the molecules. So in a way, neuroscience is the science that gets closest to the question, what is a human being? Which is why I find it so exciting and also why I think it should stay humble about what it hasn't answered.
Mm. That's a very novel approach to neuroscience because, yeah, because normally people just define it like in a scientific way. Do you think the brain is closely related to the space or the universe?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. On the surface, yes, there are roughly as many neurons in one brain, in human brain, as there are stars in the Milky Way, about 80 billion. So in a way, each of us carries a small galaxy inside our skull. But I think the connection goes deeper than that. The universe is huge and silent. The brain is the one place we know of where the universe becomes aware of itself. Every time you look up at the stars and wonder, the universe through the brain is looking back at itself. And physicists talk about fine tuning. The constants of the universe are set so precisely that if any of them were off by a tiny moment, there would be no star, no brain, no conversation like this one. So, yes, I do think the brain and the cosmos are quietly related to each other in way we have to fully understand.
Ooh, that's very interesting. Also, what's neuroscientific methods or existing result research does your argument rest on? How did you reach to your conclusion?
Great question. My argument rests on three main lines of evidence. First, Andrew Newberg's SPECT work. He scanned the Tibetan monks and Franciscan nuns at the peak of deep prayer and meditation, and he found something striking. Activity in the parietal lobe, which is the reason they maintain the sense of self versus world, actually went down. So in the deep prayer, the neural boulder of the self quiets down. Second, Adrian Owens' 26 paper in Science, he used the functional MRI on a patient in a persistent vegetative state and asked her to imagine playing tennis. Her brain lights up exactly like a healthy person's would. So the person was awake inside, unable to move or speak, but she was there. Third, terminal lucidity. Some dementia patients who have been silent for years suddenly become clear, coherent, and recognize their family, sometimes just hours before they die. And by every neurological measure, their brain should be more damaged, not less. Neurology cannot fully explain that. Put together, these three lines of evidence pushed me to this conclusion. Brain activity and personhood are not identical. The brain is where the person lives, but the brain is not the person. Yeah.
Mm. Oh, also like people in the podcast who are listening to our podcast, like there are a lot of people who are pursuing neuroscience. So do you have any comments for the students who want to pursue neuroscience?
Yeah. I'd offer three small things. First, stay humble. Neuroscience has grown incredibly in the last 30 years, but we still don't understand roughly 99% of what the brain is doing. Don't be too certain, too early. Second, read widely. Don't only read the neuroscience paper, read the literature, philosophy, theology, poetry, and art. Because the object you are eventually studying is a person, and a person is always more than a brain. And third, meet actual patient. I've learned more in a clinic room than I have in any lab. Sometimes a single face across the desk teaches you more than 10 papers. If you can, get yourself in front of patients as early as you can and let them teach you.
Mm,
Okay.
I 100% agree
Mm.
with what you just said, and
Yeah,
Um, I also think that learning is a lifelong process, and I admire you for like honoring this part that you are still learning and staying humble. So,
yeah,
people who listen to our podcast, also a lot of them are interested in how you sort of weaved theology and neuroscience together. So now we will ask some hybrid questions that are less sciencey
yeah.
and concerns like both parts of the book. So Karl Rachner's undisposable mystery, you defined it as the thing in a person that can't be seized, sold, or scanned. Is that a scientific claim, a theological one, or do you think that distinction breaks down in between?
Wow, that's a wonderful question.
Mhm.
Carl Lerner's undisposable mystery, the thing in a person that cannot be seized, sold, or scanned, is on its face a theological claim. But I want to give a slightly surprising answer. I think that theological claim is one that neuroscience is quietly arriving at from its own side. Chalmers' heart problem is basically runner in a different language. Both are saying underneath the brain activity we can measure, there is a first person experience we cannot measure. Owen's patient in the vegetative state, we could not scan her personhood, but she was still there. So Ronald's theology, Chalmers' philosophy, and Owen's neuroscience, I think they are three languages pointing at the same place. And when the same place is being pointed at from three different fields, the distinction between scientific and theological start to feel less like a war or more like a shared horizon.
Mm. Oh, I we also have additional question about
Yeah,
the things you discuss in the book. I'm pretty sure you mentioned terminal lucidity
yeah.
and Chalmers' heart problem in your book. Could you explain more about this concept?
Sure. Let me take them one at a second. Chalmers' heart problems goes like this. Neuroscience can measure the neural correlates of experience very precisely. When you see the color red, we know which neuron fire. But why the neuron firing becomes the felt experience of red, the redness of red, that gap has never been closed. Third person description and first person feeling are simply different categories. And terminal lucidity is one of the most moving clinical phenomena I've encountered. Patients who have been silent for years with advanced dementia, unable to recognize their own children, sometimes become suddenly clear in the last hour of their life. They recognize family, they thank people, they say goodbye. And by every knowledge measure, their brain should be more damaged, not less. Both of these, Chalmers' heart problem and terminal lucidity, points to the same suspicion. The brain is where the person lives, but the brain does not fully own the person.
I
Ooh.
see. Those are very deep concepts. And I saw in your introduction you kind of paired them together. So we wanted to ask, why did that pairing feel right to you as a clinician?
Because as a clinician, you spend 30 years watching moments where the brain seems to be fully in control. A stroke takes speech, dementia takes memory, and you can start to believe the strict story that the brain is the person. But then, quietly, at bedside, you also see moments where the brain has clearly lost almost everything, and yet the person is just somehow still there. Chalmers give me the philosophical language for that suspicion. Terminal lucidity gives me the clinical evidence. So when I put them side by side in the book, I'm essentially saying to the reader, this isn't just a theory. I have watched this at the bedside. And for a clinician, that pairing carries a special weight because it comes from both the philosophical seminar and the hospital room. The two are agreeing.
Mm. Also, in your book, you said that you write as a neurologist first and then a believer second. Has there been a moment in 30 years of practice where those two identities pulled against each other?
Yes, several times. Let me tell you about one that I still return to. About 20 years ago, I had a patient who have been a persistent vegetative state for 2 years after massive stroke. His daughter came every single morning and held his hand. One night, his breathing changed. His daughter leaned in and whispered, "Father, I love you." And at the moment, the corner of his mouth lifted once for less than a second. It was a smile. As a neurologist in the room, I had no clinical category for what I had just seen. I knew it wasn't just a reflex, but I couldn't call it consciousness either, by the science of the time. And as a believer, I wanted to say, the man heard his daughter. He heard her, and he tried to answer. Those two identities in me were pulling in the opposite direction that night. And then about 6 years later, Adrian Owen published his 26 paper, and I realized that what I had witnessed as a believer, the neurology was only beginning to catch up to. So the two identities collide in the room, and about 20 years later, they quietly reconcile. That is one of the moments that gave me the courage to write this book.
Oh.
This is sort of an add-up question, but both from telling from today's interview and from your book, we can tell that you're explicit that neuroscience hasn't solved the hard problem. It hasn't explained love, hasn't touched fine-tuning. So we wanted to ask you, as a scientist, how do you resist the temptation to let religion just fill in whatever gap that science leaves?
That is exactly the right question, and it's one I worried about the whole time I was writing the book. It's called the God of the Gaps problem. I try very hard to avoid it. Three things I would say. First, I don't think theology explains the heart problems. Theory is not a temporary tool that plug in wherever neuroscience is behind. Theory is a different language pointing at the same place. Second, I try not to argue, but to observe. I never say neuroscience cannot solve this, therefore God exists. I said there is an opening here, and in that opening, the language theology has been using for centuries, and the language neuroscience is arriving and now start to overlap. Let's look at that overlap, honestly. And third, I'm a doctor. In the clinic, I give a diagnosis, but I never give a verdict. I wrote the book the same way. I don't force a conclusion on the reader. I invite them to stand next to me in front of the opening and look at it with me. That discipline of not forcing is, I think, what keeps me from falling into God of the gaps.
Mm. Okay, now, unfortunately, it's already time for the last question. What would you like to say to other religious scientists like you? Is there anything that you're particularly interested in that is still unresolved?
Mm, to other religious scientists, my main message is this: don't live in two separate rooms. I lived that way for a long time, and I was, in a strange way, less honest in both of them. When I let the two rooms speak to each other, I become a better clinician and a more grounded believer. So don't be afraid. Your faith will not weaken your science. If anything, it will make you humbler and more careful. And your science will not destroy your faith. If anything, it will deepen it and make you more grown up. As for what's still unreserved that I'm most interested in is origin of consciousness itself. Is consciousness produced by the brain, or is consciousness flowing through the brain? Chalmers had problems. Owen's covert awareness, terminal lucidity. I think together they are pointing at something the field hasn't yet dared to say clearly. I plan to spend the rest of my life sitting in front of that question, and I think religious scientists have a special role to play there because you have two languages, not just one. Use them both.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Guak. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us and also so many people that are passionate about this crossover between theology and neuroscience. We're so thankful that you decided to show up to our podcast today. And we hope you guys who are listening to this podcast are interested in picking up his book.
The
Jenny
book
is
is
thank you both. That the two of you are creating a podcast that opens this question in your generation. I think that's genuinely beautiful. Your generation opening this conversation is exactly what this time needs. Thank you for having me, and to everyone listening, thank you for staying with us today.
Thank
Yay!
you. The book is called The God Neuroscience Found, and then you can find this book easily on Amazon. Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to share them with us through Instagram at HeliaArt_HYA.
Yay! Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Congrats.
Great.
Bye bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.